I'm going to be talking about the second exascale challenge, which is on complex workflows or multiple link calculations. As Scott says, this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the types of calculation that Ian was talking about. So rather than having a single large-scale calculation, we're going to think about basically lots of smaller calculations. So this might be, for example, looking at reaction taking place on a surface, but we want to look at multiple sites, so we have to run it many times over each site. Or we might be looking at trying to get the optimal structure for a material system, where we do say a genetic algorithm with a large number of candidates. Or we're using one of the many methods that involve lots of molecular dynamics or Monte Carlo runs simultaneously and then combining them in some way. And as our platforms get larger and larger, Ian's talked about a number of the ways that the kind of single large-scale model gets harder to do. And so we might expect this kind of more complex workflow to become increasingly important as a way of making use of the large-scale systems. And a lot of the problems here, rather than kind of fundamental mathematics, is more about managing the complexity of these calculations. And one way of thinking about the complexity is in terms of layers of parallelism. So what I mean by that is at the first or bottom layer, we have parallelism in terms of single calculations. So for example, in ChemShell, the code that I developed, this would be a single QMMM energy evaluation. So we have a QMMM driver, and this calls out to an external QM package or MM package. And we can make use of whatever parallelism is incorporated into those packages. So effectively, we get all the improvements that are looked at in the kind of hero type calculations. We can use that scaling in our context as well. So that's kind of an automatic layer for us, but we do have one task associated with it, and that is development of the common APIs to simplify this kind of approach of coupling codes together, which is not just useful in QMMM context, of course, but in many others as well. And Phil's already given a very good summary of what that work will involve. At the next level, then, we have parallelism of a chemical task. So a really good example of this is nudge elastic band optimization of a reaction path, which involves a series of energy and gradient evaluations along the path of the reaction of different structures. And these are effectively independent from each other, so we can do them simultaneously. So the diagram on the right shows you that you've got an optimizer. It calls out to the QMM driver multiple times, then in turn that will call the QM and the MM packages. So we effectively have two levels of parallelism now. And the reason why this is useful is the top layer, depending on your chemical task, may be an embarrassingly parallel task, which means that effectively it shows perfect parallel scaling. And so when we run into some of the limitations that we can find of trying to parallelize individual energy and gradient calculations, we can make use of this additional parallelism to keep pushing forward to higher number of core counts. And just to give you a sort of quantitative description of this, I'm not sure how well you can see this graph if you're having problems with Scott's, but you don't really need to know the numbers. Just as an example, on magnesium oxide surface, so we're doing a QMM calculation. The large spheres is the QM part, and the smaller ones the MM part. And hopefully you can see at least the red and the green lines. So what's happening here is for a fixed core count, we're dividing up the calculation into, as we go to the right, towards a greater number of simultaneous energy and gradient calculations. So because we've got a fixed number of cores, that means there's less MPI processes for each individual energy calculation, and so that's taking longer. But our time to solution, which is in the blue line, is actually rapidly going down because this top layer of parallelism is showing this kind of perfect scaling. So again, this is a kind of well-established technique. We can do this in the codes that we have in mind for the MCC, so things like ChemShell and KLMC, but other codes as well. But we do have, again, a task associated with it for this working group, which is to think about fault tolerance in these algorithms. So you can imagine when we get up to the exascale level, you might want to do many more images than you could have done before, and each one of these has a certain chance of failure. And what happens when one of these calculations does fail? Does that mean we have to go abandon the calculation and start all over again, or can we design into the algorithm some way of recovering from this and carrying on without losing all the computational work that we've done so far. So then the top level that I want to think about is, rather than just parallelizing individual energy calculations or chemical tasks, we can think about performing many tasks together. And this is what we think about when we're talking about complex workflows. So this will go back to the original examples that I mentioned. So things like running multiple energy optimizations or doing large scale screening of huge molecule sets, something like that. And effectively what we have is a large number of independent calculations, and we have to think about what is the best way of running these in the materials chemistry context. Do we want to implement an additional layer in the software packages that we already got, whether it's ChemShell or KLMC or whatever is being used in the MCC community, or do we want to start thinking more about the kind of generic frameworks that are out there for running workflows? And I've got on this slide, the next slide, a few examples of the ones that we've name checked in our proposal. This is very far from an exhaustive list. There's all sorts of efforts out there to kind of manage this kind of workflows. So we'd be very interested if you've had any experience of using these ones on the slide or any others, how you've got on. Just to go down the list quickly, there's Longbow, which is a COSEC initiative. So that's by our sister consortium HEC Biosim, who have developed a job submission engine which can be used for this kind of task. There's general workflow managers like AIDA and Fireworks, and then there's also another class of work which is more focused on code coupling, so things like multi-scale computing patterns. And one example of this is the COMPAT EU project, which a couple of the co-Is have been involved with. So just to give an example of what a scientific challenge might be, of course, this is a very general problem, so there's probably hundreds of challenges that might benefit from this kind of work, but just to kind of get you thinking, one possible example is to look at yttria-stabilised zirconia. So these are, you can find these in nanoparticles that are potential uses in various places in materials chemistry. And if we wanted to study the catalysis that might take place on a nanoparticle, you can imagine ideally we'd want to first of all create a load of nanoparticles with representative in terms of the sizes that you see experimentally, optimize all of those, and then we'd have reactions taking place at any kind of site on those nanoparticles. So we'd want NEB optimizations of all of these. And you can certainly imagine that this becomes very quickly a large combinatorial problem. So how do we approach this in a high throughput manner? Kind of semi-automated way. Of course, it's not going to be fully automated because we always need chemical intuition, some parts. And what's the optimal way of using the resources that we have in order to approach this kind of problem? So I'd be very interested to hear of your experiences of any kind of problem of this nature and on the frameworks that you've used. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Tom.
Sorry, go.
Sorry, Tom. Thanks for that. Very good. We've had some questions related, but I think that's part of your remit as well. To if you were, for example, had many different length scales, you'd have QM and maybe finite differences as 3 different regions in your model, and you want to automatically load balance. Where do you need the CPUs or the cores to be distributed so that the whole calculation finishes in one go rather than waiting for one particular region to catch up, as it were? But I think in the interest of time, we should go next.
Yeah, so that's definitely something we want to look at in the breakout session, I think. Yeah, so load balancing is a really important part of the concerns.